Zhongguo, China, the Middle Kingdom. Welcome. Going to take a really quick look at Chinese culture. But first, a little bit about the history of the country. The Shang Dynasty was the first recorded, and they managed to come up with wine heaters on nice chilly evenings. The Qin Dynasty, terracotta warriors, I'm sure you've all seen those before, and the compass came along. Confucius shows up about 500 years before Christ. The Tang Dynasty, Wu Zetian is the only woman empress that I know of. The Song Dynasty came up with paper money and stock exchanges. The Ming Dynasty with Zheng He, he was a famous guy who sailed all over the place, went from China over to Africa, got around quite a lot. The Qing Dynasty was the last dynasty, and that was where all of the fighting happened, the Opium Wars, things like that originated from there. And as you can see, these guys are trying to carve up the country. And then in 1912, the Republic of China was formed with Sun Yat-sen, who's sitting in the picture, excuse me, and Chiang Kai-shek is standing adjacent to him, started up Taiwan. Mao Zedong came along in 1949, and I'm sure you know that story. Xi Jinping in 2008, and he's recently become party chief for life. And he started what's called the Belt and Road Initiative to try and reinstitute the Silk Road. So that's a quick look at the history. For the culture, the first thing I want to mention is the idea of a philosophy and a religion. First of all, the religion, the Tao Te Ching, or the religion, because it has an aspect to it for life and death. And Wu Wei is the sort of basic course of non-action, meaning that you take action by not taking action. It's one of those conundrums or paradoxes that's reasonably prevalent in Chinese society, perfectly okay to exist in that form. A little more about that in a minute. And then Confucius, I'm sure you know about. Ran, seriousness, generosity, sincerity, diligence, and kindness. It's more of a philosophy because it has to do with how you live, not so much life and death issues. And it still is pretty common, at least in our experience in China. So first, let me tell you about a metaphor for China. This comes from a gentleman named Gannon. He uses the Great Wall. This is for mainland China. For people who are not from mainland China, like Singaporeans, for example, the metaphor is a family altar. So, as I mentioned on the paradox and the context, the Chinese language requires that you know the context in order to put meaning with things. The characters are numerous, and the pronunciations across China from north to south, east to west are quite variable. And so you have to rely on the logograms to be able to understand meaning. And you have to be, in order to do that, you have to know the context within which someone is speaking to you. So first of all, it's a both and, not an either or culture. It relies heavily on grays, not blacks and whites. And it's perfectly okay, for example, in a negotiation to talk about 6 different things at the same time. It doesn't need to be linear. It doesn't need to be all perfectly symmetrical. And the Chinese people are quite comfortable occupying that space, where others not so much. Confucian ethics and harmony, especially the idea of harmony. When you're within China, the idea is to be part of a harmonious whole. And sometimes that's a difficult thing, especially in business. And then I mentioned Wu Wei a moment ago, the art of not doing anything, to let life unfold in front of you. Mindfulness, if you would, an early version of that. For attitudes, there's Guanxi, which is building relationships and trust. And it's part of the idea of the wall, is that in order to break into business, you need to have relationships established. And then the Great Firewall, which is now the internet, it was originally called the Golden Shield, where companies like Facebook or Amazon have to take decisions about whether or not they're going to play by the rules in China as far as censorship is concerned. And so penetrating the market, in addition to trust and face and the firewall, is quite challenging for many companies. And then last of all are the numerous behaviors, face, saving face, and giving face, and preserving face are particularly important in China. They are especially important even today. As I mentioned earlier, the logograms, there are 50,000 of them, and this is another barrier because in order to be able to speak the language, people have told me you have to memorize at least 5,000 of them. So it's a barrier to people who want to do business in the country and want to be respectful and learn the language. And it's a high context culture, so as much is said by what's not said as is said by what is said. And so for inventions, a quick look, alcohol came along a long time ago, then silk, tea, acupuncture, iron and steel, and more, compasses, paper, wheelbarrows, all kinds of things. Chinese society is quite rich in terms of the inventions that they brought to mankind. And then for the arts, just a really tiny sample. Music, the erhu, which I have a fondness for. Food, dim sum and Peking duck, just 2 of the thousands of different varieties. The porcelain, the carving, the painting, and I'm particularly fond of the calligraphy. It's practiced in the parks as well. And that's it for today. Thanks.